Welcome to the Saturday Cadence podcast. I'm Blake Biscardi, and remember, the Saturday Cadence podcast is the heartbeat of college football. We've got new CFP rankings and all this big noon kickoff controversy. We're going to talk about all of that. Plus, we've got Tennessee, Georgia coming up this weekend in a crucial SEC showdown for the playoff conference championship implications. So welcome into Saturday Cadence. My name is Blake Biscardi. I've got Grant Kincaid and David Wertheim ready to go for our show today. This is the 98th episode. So, David, all this big noon kickoff controversy, we're seeing these noon kickoffs. The team that's been in the news the most is Ohio State, now finishing the year with 6 straight games that start at noon. I don't know if any team has ever had to do that, ranked in the top 5. But here the Buckeyes are. They're going to have Northwestern this week, Indiana at home. That's a top 5 matchup as it stands right now. And then the big game against Michigan. What do you make first of this Big Ten media rights deal? We know this whole thing with Kevin Warren. He was a disaster as a commissioner for the Big Ten. He did broker this deal, and it was presented where you have 3 different networks, Fox, CBS, and NBC, but each of them kind of gets their exclusivity to a time slot, Fox being the big noon game and also having most of the number 1 picks in the draft. Then you bring in the West Coast teams trying to add into this, and it just feels like the cards are stacked against an Ohio State or a Michigan, which are 2 big brands, a little bit of Penn State, to carry the weight of this big noon kickoff, and that's what's happened this year. So what do you make of all this controversy that's going on? Do you agree with it? Do you think these schools should approach the Big Ten and Tony Petitti to try to renegotiate, or what's the path forward, and what are your thoughts on this, since it's cycling all around college football as we watch the SEC have big game after big game at 3:30 and 7:30?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a double-edged sword. So I'll start with this. First of all, I was in Columbus last week for Ohio State's win over Purdue, which again was one of those 6 noon games that you mentioned. And it wasn't bad. It wasn't a bad atmosphere for a noon game against Purdue. Ohio State was favored by 40 points or whatever it was, and they won by 40 points or whatever it was. But it was still a full house, and the crowd was pretty loud, and it was lively. And so on one hand, I'll say that. And for all the comments that have been made by Ohio State fans about the in-game experience at the shoe and whatnot, I didn't think it was that bad on Saturday. So I do want to give credit to Ohio State there and their fans, certainly. But on the other hand, yeah, I mean, 6 in a row is tough. I mean, you think about like the 1960s, 1950s before these stadiums had lights, and you were playing every game at noon. And now it's like, okay, well, we have lights. Like we can play later in the day, but they're not. And it is frustrating. And Ohio State is clearly carrying the weight. And Michigan clearly carried the weight last year. And I'm sure it's frustrating for those 2 schools. I mean, night games, obviously I was a student at Ohio State. I went to some really cool night games. I went to a night game that they lost against Oklahoma in 2017. That was a cool game. I went to a night game that they won against Penn State in 2017. That was incredible. And it's a really cool experience. There have been others. I think they played Michigan State at night in 2021. I was at that game. It was a blowout, but it was still a super cool atmosphere. So I was at the University of Florida a couple weeks ago. I mean, it was 3-3 Florida against 3-3 Kentucky at 7:30, and it was awesome. It was electric. Gainesville was rocking. So, I've seen it all across the country, and I've seen it at all kind of time slots. So I can definitely sense the frustration. I think I would agree that the in-game atmosphere is better at night. But at the same time, it's kind of what you make of it. And I've seen that being echoed on Twitter a lot lately, especially on the Ohio State beat, that, hey, just because it's noon, that doesn't mean you can't be loud. And I agree with that. But at the same time, it is nice to shake it up. I would expect that the big-time schools, Ohio State, Michigan, will go back to Tony Petitti in the Big Ten and say, look, something's got to change here. We can't do this 6 times in a row in a single season. I mean, that's just crazy. So hopefully they'll get some adjustments made for next year. But yeah, it's kind of brutal having 6 in a row. Although I think the players, I think the players kind of like it.
Kind of to piggyback off what Dave was saying is, it's absolutely true that it's weird playing that many noon games in a row and having to play at noon every single time when we're not used to that in the past. But also, like you said, at noon, you can still be loud, you can still yell. So I don't think, people have a valid excuse of like, well, like it's just we're gonna lose games or it's not gonna be fun. It's like, well, then like that's your attitude. We can't fix that for you. Um, but you know, it's also the fact that, like you said, these stadiums have lights, and every single night, ESPN and ABC are featuring basically the SEC game of the week in the primetime slot. So and I think people are kind of noticing this pattern of like, okay, we're dominating this slot, but like how is it in any way like okay to have that many noon games and just never play at night, especially at home? It's kind of a weird how it transpired, and like you said, Kevin Warren kind of left us in a little bit of this mess, but we're gonna have to, you know, play at noon no matter what, and gonna have to deal with it.
Well, I think what's interesting too, when you look at the whole Big Ten contract and conference expansion with the teams that they added Oregon and Washington, and then USC and UCLA. All four of those teams are West Coast teams, and none of them can play a local game at noon on the East Coast. So that would be a 9 o'clock local time kick on the West Coast. You just can't have that. You're not kicking off a game for Oregon and insert team here at 9 a.m. to fulfill the slot. So from that perspective, there's no value add for those West Coast teams when it comes to the Fox big noon kickoff slot. So your times basically for the West Coast teams are 3:30, 4:30, and 7:30. And you saw that when Ohio State went out west, and when Penn State went out west, they got a 3:30 kick out there on the East Coast, which is still a nooner out west. And then you had Ohio State and Oregon at 7:30 on the East Coast, 4:30 out on the West Coast. But I mean, that's going to be few and far between with all those matchups. To get the West Coast teams involved, you need to bring Oregon to Ann Arbor at noon, or you need to have USC come to Columbus or UCLA go to Happy Valley or whatever it is. Because when you're looking at these teams and how they rate, the Big Ten is not deep as a conference. And I think when you're looking at the Big Ten and the SEC this year, and I know this is going to be more spoken out over time because this is pretty much how the conferences operate. The SEC is always the deeper conference, and most of the time they have the elite teams at the top. The Big Ten has always been top heavy, whether it's just Ohio State and Michigan. Adding the new teams this year, it's Ohio State and Oregon, then Penn State, and Indiana's been playing really well, but Indiana's not going to rate nationally to the point where they're going to be on big noon multiple times. Oregon can be on big noon. And then are you going to look at Penn State and Minnesota or Penn State and Iowa or Penn State and Rutgers? Like that game will not rate the same as Ohio State against insert team here or Michigan when they're good against insert team here. Those fan bases just have more viewership than all these other schools. So they're carrying the lion's share of this time slot. And then you look at even Ohio State, David, this is to your point. The atmosphere is what you make it. And yes, it is better at night. And like you said, double-edged sword. Ohio State fans listening, would you want that Penn State game to have been at night in Happy Valley? Every single one of you is going to say no. Is it a cool spectacle for an outsider or for a Penn State fan? Yes. But as the opposing fan, you'd rather have that game at noon. But Ohio State's last meaningful conference home games were, what was it, 2022 against Wisconsin. That team finished 7-6. 21 against Penn State. That game was on ABC. Chris Fowler, Kirk Herbstreit on the call. 2018 against Penn State. Same thing. Those are all ABC games. Fox is keeping every single game at noon, and I think that they have to go because of this West Coast involvement. They have to go to Tony Petitti, and I think you need all, if not most, of the bigger schools to approach Petitti and say we need to renegotiate with this because if Fox is having the number one pick, which they pay the most money and they should because they've earned it and they bought it, you got to have other options than just Ohio State being on big noon in 5 of the last 6 weeks of the season because it's just too much. David, how do you navigate that even with Ohio State going to Wrigley this week? I think there's some safety issues playing at a baseball stadium, which now we're diving down the rabbit hole a little bit, but what do you even think of going to play at Wrigley Field? Like, why couldn't the Big Ten figure this out and say, okay, you can't play at Soldier Field because of the Bears. You're not going to go to Green Bay. It's too far. Why can't you go to Indianapolis? The Colts are away. Why are you playing at a baseball stadium this late in the season with a top 5 team as opposed to Northwestern's home stadium, which holds I think 10,000 fans in that temporary one that they have because they want to sell out Wrigley Field with more tickets because Ohio State's going to do that. It didn't
Right.
matter where this game's going to play.
Yeah. No, I mean, looking at it, I'm sure Ryan Day and the Ohio State administration can't be happy with it, right? I mean, it seems like they're always getting the short end of the stick, whether it's opening the season on a weeknight or playing a game at a baseball stadium or the Nooners or whatever the case may be. It just seems like Ohio State is always getting the shaft here, and it makes sense. I mean, they are the draw. They are the Big Ten. The Big Ten, as we know it, would not exist if Ohio State was not in the conference. It would probably turn into what the Big 12 is now. And, just speaking honestly, that's just how it has pretty much always been. I mean, since Michigan's kind of downturn in the late '90s there up until recently, Ohio State was kind of a one man show in the conference. So they're always going to carry the weight. I don't expect that to ever change, really. And it's got to be frustrating for the powers that be out there to have to go through this something different year after year after year.
No, it's definitely weird, and it's I think kind of what's happening, kind of going back to your question, Blake, is Fox is kind of like garnering a little too much power, and especially in that slot. And Joe Klatt like made a tweet about it, saying like, "Hey, the noon slot used to be this and that. No one cared about it. We brought this many viewers to the noon slot," and they're like, "Yeah, because you hijacked Ohio State's viewership. If you're if you're gonna give the time slot to the biggest fan base, college fan base, arguably in the world, like of course you're gonna get huge ratings." So it's just that's how I think it's kind of happening right now. Whether anything actually happens to kind of, I don't know, not punish Fox, but relinquish a little bit of their power, I'm not sure. But Wrigley Field is it worries me. It looks like it's just kind of like thrown together in a day. There are definitely hazards, here and there, and obviously we don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole like you're saying, but it just seems like they, like you said, they're like let's capitalize on this Ohio State game, and if we can get the Cubs grounds crew to agree to let this happen, why not do it? So it's going to be interesting to see just how it plays out on the field this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, even Ryan Day's making a comment in his press conference saying they're not going to be able to use the locker room at halftime. They're going to meet and huddle in the bullpen. I mean, what are we doing? The right sideline is pretty tight. You can barely stand there. It almost looks like both teams have to stay on the same side. I don't know if that's going to happen. I mean, you pretty much can't do that logistically. And then you have walls coming out in the side of the end zone. I don't see how this is
Yeah,
a good idea outside of getting
I mean, there
the
was a
two teams
reason
there.
that teams don't play in stadiums with baseball fields anymore. It's just a nightmare for both. um, so yeah, I think we're just kind of like bringing it back and realizing how crazy it is. And it's just odd. It's different, but I don't know. It'll be interesting.
I mean, I think so too. And it will be cool from the historical aspect to see the Ohio State Scarlet and Gray in Wrigley Field, such a historic sports venue, although just not for football. So it's not something you want to see in November. But let's get to the college football playoff rankings. They came out again last night. Oregon staying at the top of the poll, Ohio State right behind, and then Texas. David, looking at these rankings, what were your main takeaways? Because I know there's been some confusion with the bracket and who gets the bye. I do think that if BYU loses, I don't think a second Big 12 team can get in. I think it's only going to be one. And then I'm raising this point to say, let's just say Colorado goes and wins the Big 12. Boise State's ranked enough ahead of them. They're 12 right now, ranked 13. And then Colorado's sitting back there at 17. Boise State could, in theory, as the G5 team, get that fourth auto bid and have a bye over a Power Four conference champion. So I think that's going to present some problems if you're a Big Ten advocate or if you're an SEC representative, because those two teams would see something like that happen and be like, what are we doing with these auto bids?
Yeah.
We need to be in. So
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on this bracket and the rankings coming out the other night?
Well, I think they're going to have to change it because you're right. I mean, one of these Big Ten teams, whether it's Ohio State or Oregon, is probably going to finish with one loss, and they won't have a bye. They'll finish with one loss, and they'll be the number 2 ranked team in the country, and they won't have a bye. Now, obviously, if Ohio State loses to Oregon again, they still might be the number 2 team, honestly, if it's another close game. But I could see them dropping to just the number 5 ranking in general in that scenario, and then they'd kind of avoid this mess. But yeah, no, I think I agree with what you're saying. Similarly, I think with that Boise State versus Colorado thing, if BYU were to lose, I think they would just rank Colorado a slot or 2 ahead of Boise State in that scenario, just to get that conversation piece
Like a
out. It would
save
be
face,
irrelevant.
yeah.
Yeah, right. They're saving face basically. But as for the rankings this week, I think it makes sense. Obviously, Miami finally took a tumble after losing their first game. I expect that they'll lose another one. And really, the ACC is going to be interesting. You wonder if 2 ACC teams even get in. I doubt it at this point, just looking at the rankings. You have a 2-loss Clemson down there. You have SMU at 8-1. You have Miami at 9-1. I don't think there's a way that SMU and Miami get in. And you don't count Notre Dame as an ACC team. So I could see honestly just one from each of those conferences, the ACC and a Big 12. A team like Notre Dame's probably going to get in, which is crazy. You can lose your first game in Northern Illinois at home and still be in a good position to make the college football playoff. But that's just the world we're in now. But as for the rankings this week, I think it makes sense. I like Ole Miss over Georgia, obviously Alabama over Ole Miss. Kind of makes sense down there in the SEC. Kansas State, Colorado, of course. You have to have Colorado a little lower down there. But yeah, no, and then you have the classic SEC backfiller at the end of the rankings to make everybody else look better with, 3 loss South Carolina, LSU in there, and then just a terrible Missouri team ranked at 23. So that's always classic. But overall, no real issues with the rankings this week, I would say.
I think I've been doing a good job to the committee. And David, to your point where you're saying, okay, if Oregon loses, they have a loss, and then that's Ohio State and Oregon both sitting at the top of the poll, probably as 1 and 2, maybe 1 and 3. But let's even double click that a little bit more. Let's say Ohio State beats Indiana and Ohio State wins the rematch with Oregon. You have 4 one-loss Big Ten teams, 3 of which have playoff resumes for the 4-team playoff. So looking at that, you think at least 2 of them should be in the 4-team playoff. And Ohio State and Oregon, regardless of outcome of the Big Ten championship, should that be the rematch, would be deserving of a spot in the 4-team playoff. But let's take those 4 one-loss Big Ten teams, if that's how it plays out, and then look at 6 2-loss SEC teams. And I think a couple of those SEC teams would have an argument over a 1-loss BYU, a 1-loss or a 2-loss Miami, or a 2-loss SMU, however that shakes out. I actually think the ACC and the Big 12 will get 1 team in each because they don't have a choice. They have the auto bid. And then I think you're going to backfill this playoff with Big 10 and SEC teams. And I think you're going to see 4 Big 10, 4 SEC, Notre Dame, a group of 5 team looking like Boise, potentially Army, depending on what happens. And then you go from there. There is a world, though. I hope they're not setting up for this. If Indiana loses to Ohio State, let's just say by double digits, not bad, but maybe by 2 touchdowns or so, that they make Indiana fall, because we keep hearing about the strength of schedule of Indiana and we keep hearing about the rigor of the SEC. It's almost like they're setting up for, hey, this might happen. If Indiana loses, they're going to get Florida Stated and, a backfilled with an SEC team. So, Grant, do you think that's feasible for the committee to do? Because I think Indiana, with 1 loss, even though they played an easy schedule, you can't help the teams on your schedule. But if you lose 1 game, I think you should be in the playoff if you're playing in the Big Ten.
I think I think the committee values Indiana already. I think that's why, obviously, Ohio State and Texas and Penn State are all ahead of them with 1 loss. But having Indiana at 5, I feel like that kind of puts them in a spot where, yeah, they could afford even a decently bad loss to Ohio State if they've more than taken care of business everywhere else on their schedule. So I think that it would be hard to drop them completely out, but like you said, it is possible. We have all of these teams. We have the Alabama, the Mississippi, the Georgia sitting there at 10, 11, and 12. Where are they going to go? And I think that's the big question.
No, I'm with you. And I'm very curious to see how all this plays out, because Indiana at 5 should be enough, even if they lose, that they should be safe. But Georgia out there lurking in the shadows, they need to win this weekend. That's what their rankings told me. Georgia has to beat Tennessee in order to have a shot to get to the playoff. And I still don't think they could even get to the SEC championship game, even if they win it. The tiebreakers in the SEC are outrageous. But let's look at this game here. Tennessee going to Georgia. Nico Amalavea's health is in question, had the concussion. It looks like he's going to play, even though Chris Felica said that he's hearing that he may not. I did read that he practiced, so there is conflicting reports out there on Nico. And as you would expect before a big game like that, because that's a massive, massive impact there as Tennessee's quarterback. David, when you look at this game, Georgia's had a lot of turnover problems with Carson Beck. He's tied for the most interceptions in college football this year from a quarterback position at Georgia, thinking that he could win the Heisman and be the best quarterback in the country this year. Georgia's backed into a corner in this matchup. And it almost feels like one where you think Tennessee has some edges in a couple places. You think Tennessee is the better team, but Georgia just can't lose because they're backed into that corner. And you're basically taking the resolve and the character of the program and a Kirby Smart coach team and saying they're going to find a way to win this at home.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. It's been a while, honestly, since we've seen a Georgia team like this. I just don't think they're a very good football team. And it makes sense, right? I mean, they've had two national championship teams recently. They've had so many players head off to the NFL. The attrition has been unbelievable. I mean, you're turning over your roster pretty much every year with the amount of early departures and transfers and things and whatnot that they've had. So they were due for a down year. But yeah, it's still been surprising. I would agree that the only way that Tennessee has a chance is if Nico plays, and I think they would tell you the same thing. And it certainly, like you said, makes sense that they're kind of being coy about it. But yeah, Georgia absolutely is backed into a corner. This is a game they have to win, and ultimately, I think they do.
Yeah, it's like you said, the whole situation with Nico, how it's playing out, it's very interesting. He has so much talent, so who knows what's going to happen there. But I do think kind of where David left off is this is Georgia's season, and Carson Beck is playing. I mean, worse than you could have ever imagined for someone who was projected as, I mean, the number one overall quarterback in a lot of mock drafts. So it's going to be interesting to see how Kirby Smart handles this situation, and it's not going to be an easy game for either team, and but it's cool kind of to see a Tennessee and a Georgia game with this much implication, with two lost teams. So it is kind of something that the playoff is providing for us, which will be fun to watch.
I think this is going to be a complete defensive battle in this game, honestly. I know Tennessee profiles as one of the best SEC defenses in the conference in the country. Georgia's defense has played well in the big games outside of the first half against Alabama. So I expect Georgia's defense to show up and play with an attitude similar to the game against Texas. And, looking at the game, we'll pick it here and then we'll move into the Saturday 7 pick segment. The spread on this game is 10, and I'm looking at that game. If Nico's fully healthy, that's a lot of points to give Tennessee, a Tennessee team I actually think is better than this Georgia team. But like we were all mentioning, I just don't think Georgia loses the game. So I'll take Georgia to win, but I like Tennessee to cover. David, how do you see this game? And then Grant.
Yeah, I'm going Georgia to win and cover here. I think Kirby coaches well when his back is against the wall. So I think Georgia's going to take care of this one.
I have to piggyback off of David there. Just, it is Georgia's season, like I said, and Kirby Smart at home, in that environment. I just don't think that Tennessee is going to be able to handle it, and I think Georgia will cover as well.
So let's look elsewhere in the SEC here. We've got Texas 13.5-point favorites in Fayetteville against Arkansas. David, how do you see this game playing out? You think it's trap game vibes for Texas going to Fayetteville? I know that's tricky for some SEC teams, or you think the Longhorns handle business?
No, I think they handle business. I'm not sold on this Arkansas team at all. I think Sam Pittman is quietly on the hot seat. I know he still has some decent fan support there, but it hasn't really been that incremental growth that you would have liked to see in a program like that. So I'm going to take Texas here.
I'm going to take Texas as well. I think, Arkansas, when they beat Tennessee, we thought that was perhaps, a bigger win than it is now. But Texas is just too talented, possibly as talented as anyone else in the country, and I think they'll cover.
I've got Arkansas in this game. I think Arkansas will find a way to cover in the game. Quinn Ewers, I think, turns the football over a couple times, so I'll take Arkansas plus 13.5 there. Let's go to the Big 12, Utah at Colorado. This is the biggest game in Boulder in more than a decade. Colorado favored by 10.5. I think they win the game, and I think they cover in this matchup. Utah is going to have a hangover effect from that game last week against BYU.
Yeah, I think Colorado wins, Utah covers. This is like a Kyle Whittingham special, I feel like. I think Utah will be their typical disciplined self, but Colorado has a little bit more talent, and they win the game.
Yeah, I think Utah covers, but Colorado wins. Colorado looks too good right now.
Yeah, I actually think they win the Big 12. So we'll look in the Big 10 now. Oregon 14-point favorites in Madison, Wisconsin against the Badgers. Luke Fickell will have his team ready to play in this game. I just think Oregon's going to be too much. They have that speed. It's going to look like that old school Ohio State Oregon game where the speed just takes over. So I think the Ducks win and cover that 14.
Yeah, Wisconsin played a good half against Penn State. I think they do something similar here against Oregon. They play a good half, but Oregon's too much, and they pull away and cover this one.
Yeah, the line is maybe a little less than I would have thought. I think Oregon is, really, really good, and Wisconsin just has not much of an identity. So I'm going to take Oregon to cover that 14.
Yeah, styles make fights in this game, and I just don't think they match, especially for 60 full minutes. But we'll go Tulane Navy next. Navy, the home team here in this game, they are 6.5-point dogs at home. I think Tulane's playing well, and I think they could vie potentially if Boise State would lose because Army plays Notre Dame for that G5 spot. So I'm going to take Tulane to win and cover that 6.5 in this matchup.
I am going to take Navy. I like rooting for the service academies. This is a good Navy squad. Kind of a real good year for the service academies. So hopefully they can keep it rolling. I'll be rooting for the military here. Go Navy, beat Army, I guess.
Yeah, I'm gonna pick Navy to win because, kind of like Dave said, it makes me feel morally superior. So, yep.
Now you guys make me feel like I'm not as patriotic, and I bleed red, white, and blue. Just not
You're
blue
just
and
not supporting the troops.
We'll go Missouri, South Carolina here. I have PTSD from Navy playing Notre Dame, where I thought that they would cover in that game, and then Navy just blew the doors off them. So that was my reasoning for going Tulane in that game. But back to the SEC here. South Carolina is one of the hottest teams in the country. They're 12-point favorites at home to Missouri. Missouri's a team I left for dead. I said they were canceled, but I put them back on the board anyway just to tell them they're still canceled. So I will take the Gamecocks to cover that 12 and win.
Missouri is canceled. Hawks roll.
Yeah. Missouri forever canceled. We're rooting for the Cox all day.
All right, we'll go Kansas BYU here. BYU favored by 3. This is a very tricky matchup. The Jayhawks just beat Iowa State, and they controlled that game. BYU now, will they have a hangover from the Holy War against Utah? Will they not? I think they win and they cover, but I do think it's ugly.
That's a weird line. 3 is a weird line in this.
It
one.
is very.
Something's going on. I'm going to take BYU here.
What's
but
Kansas doing? What's in the
fishy.
water in Kansas? Yeah.
Yeah, something's fishy. I'm going to take BYU, but something doesn't smell right.
Yeah, I'm gonna take BYU as well. I think they're a much better team than that line, but it is interesting. I'll take them to cover though.
Yeah, it's a very, very fishy line. Somebody knows something, but I think BYU finds a way, just like they've done for the majority of the season. But just to remind everybody of our Tennessee-Georgia picks, this is the last game. I took Georgia to win, but Tennessee to cover. Dave and Grant, you guys both had Georgia to win and cover, correct?
Yes.
Yep.
All right. Well, guys, thank you for listening to today's show. We appreciate you listening. Make sure to like and subscribe to our channel and leave us a review. Check us out on social media at Saturday Cadence for more content throughout the week. And remember, the Saturday Cadence podcast is the heartbeat of college football. For David Wertheim and Grant Kincaid, enjoy the weekend of college football. My name is Blake Biscardi, and we will see you next time. God bless.